Okay, everybody. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our global online event where we will look at the challenges and hear firsthand about the inspiring work of land and environmental defenders. My name is Rachel Cox. I'm a campaigner at Global Witness on the Land and Environmental Defenders team, and I'll be your chair for today's event. Before we start, I'm just going to run through a few practical matters. So the structure of today's talk will focus on short statements from our speakers, followed by a question and answer session. Some of the questions have been submitted before the event, but you can also submit questions as the conversation is taking place by using the chat function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. If a question comes to mind at any time, then please type it into the chat box in the lower right-hand corner and press enter to submit. And towards the end of the Q&A session, we will choose one or two to put to the panel, depending if we have some time left. Okay, so that's housekeeping done. We are honoured, really, to be joined today by some esteemed speakers who are leaders in protecting land and the environment. First, I would like to introduce Se-Jin Kim, who leads the Human Rights Defenders campaign at the Asia Forum for Human Rights and Development, also known as Forum Asia. She will be speaking after our first after our short Global Witness statement. Then hopefully we will have Alfred Brownell speaking. He should be on his way and hopefully he'll join by the time we get to this part. Alfred is an environmental lawyer, a professor and activist who splits his time between Liberia and the US. He's the winner of the Goldman Environmental Prize for Africa in 2019, and the founder and lead campaigner of Green Advocates International. And I believe he's joined us now. So hopefully, Alfred, you heard my introduction. Then we welcome Lynn Dulce, who joins us in his role as the national coordinator for the Kalikasan People's Network for the Environment in the Philippines. And finally, we will hear from Timur Manurung, the chairman of Auriga, an organization that strives to conserve Indonesia's natural resources and the environment. I'd just like to take a moment to thank all of our speakers for joining us today and giving up their time. I'm now going to speak about some of the context of Global Witness's latest annual report, Defending Tomorrow, which we released just a few weeks ago. But before I explore some of our top line findings from that report, I think it's important to first look at the here and now and begin our conversation by flagging some of the new and urgent threats against defenders as a result of the ongoing impacts of COVID-19. In this new global context, we've seen land and environmental defenders face increasing challenges. Already, early indications from this year suggest that threats and attacks against land environmental activists have accelerated during this COVID-19 crisis period, with governments across the world cracking down on protest, limiting free speech, and increasing surveillance. We also know that some irresponsible businesses are using the lack of scrutiny to continue or accelerate damaging projects. It's worth saying, really, that when we started writing the report Defending Tomorrow, we wanted to highlight the climate leadership that generations of land and environmental defenders have played, many of whom are the first line of defense against the causes and impacts of climate breakdown. But the COVID-19 crisis has brought into even sharper focus just how crucial defenders are for the future health, well-being and green recovery of the planet in this moment. Yet our most recent report shows that now, more than ever, the cost of speaking out is high, both for individuals and their communities. In our report this year, we recorded 212 land environmental defenders killed in 2019. That's an average of more than 4 people murdered a week. This is just the sharp end, with reports showing that many more defenders were attacked, jailed or face smear campaigns because of their work. Shockingly, over half of all of the reported killings from last year occurred in just two countries, Colombia and the Philippines. In Colombia, reports show that murders of community and social leaders across the country have risen dramatically in the last few years, with 64 activists reportedly killed. Those protecting their land and the environment were most at risk in 2019. Across the ocean, our reporting has consistently identified the Philippines as one of the worst places in Asia for attacks. Last year, the country saw a rise from 30 killings of land environmental activists in 2018 to 43 in 2019. We also found that Europe remains the least affected continent. So we recorded 2 people who were killed in 2019, both who were working to stop illegal logging in Romania. Whilst across Africa, 7 environmental activists were reported murdered last year, though it's important to note that verifying cases from across the continent remains difficult for us. Limited monitoring of the issue by civil society, media repression, and localized conflict means that attacks are likely underreported in some regions, and that's an issue that we face worldwide, but specifically in regions where we find our data, it's harder for us to collect data. Looking a little closer at the sector statistics, we've seen a rise in the number of defenders killed after opposing extractive industries. So the top 3 from 2019 being mining, agribusiness, and logging. Mining was the sector linked to the most murders globally, with 50 defenders killed in 2019. More than half of those deaths were from mining-affected communities in Latin America. The Philippines was the country with the most mining-related killings, with 16 deaths. According to our data, Asia has consistently been the worst region for agribusiness-related attacks. In 2019, 85% of such attacks recorded by Global Witness were in Asia. Of these, almost 90% were in the Philippines. As I touched on earlier, in this year's report, we made a real effort to focus on the link between halting climate breakdown and the role of land environmental defenders. We know that land environmental defenders play a vital role in protecting climate critical forests and ecosystems. We know how superior their land management is. Research has already shown us that Indigenous and local communities around the world are managing forests that contain carbon equivalent to 33 times our current annual emissions. There is increasing recognition that the climate crisis is a human rights crisis. But unless civil society space for legitimate protest is protected, there will be no climate justice. That also means considering the different dynamics at play, and we uncover some of these in our latest report. For example, we found that Indigenous peoples are at a disproportionate risk of reprisals. Last year, 40% of murdered defenders belonged to Indigenous communities. Between 2015 and 2019, over a third of all fatal attacks have targeted Indigenous communities or Indigenous people. Even though Indigenous communities make up only 5% of the world's population, they are some of the most at-risk communities across the globe. We also found that last year, over 1 in 10 defenders killed were women. Often the backbone of their communities, women tend to take on more responsibility at home, on top of earning a living or working as activists. Women who act and speak out may also face gender-specific threats, including sexual violence, or become targets if other members of their household are more visible defenders in the community. Thank you for listening. That was a very, very brief overview of our latest annual report for 2019. And fundamentally, what our report shows is that it is now more than ever, it is absolutely vital that we stand with those defending our future and turn the tide of violence, and also just change the course of the climate crisis. For that reason, it's my honour to now hand over to our esteemed speakers for their statements. And I'm pleased to start with Se-Jin Kim, who is the Program Manager at Asia Forum for Human Rights and Development.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sejin. I'm the Human Rights Defenders Program Manager at Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development. Forum Asia is a regional membership organization based in Bangkok, Thailand, with 81 members across 21 Asian countries. One of our thematic priorities is protection of human rights defenders in the region. I'm very glad to join this important panel discussion as we have been continuously working and addressing abuse and violation against the land and environment rights defenders in Asia. They are our friends, mothers, brothers, and sisters and daughters who try to protect the land environment, environments, and all related rights, including right to access to natural resource and right to clean and healthy environment. Many of them are also indigenous and tribal peoples, farming and peasant groups, as well as the local communities whose land, life, and livelihood are threatened by the exploitation of the environment and establishment of a development project that violates people's rights. Forum Asia has been documenting abuse and violation against defenders for a few years. I'd like to share some statistics and figures to show the situation of the land environment rights defenders on the ground. From 2017 to June 2020, Forum Asia has documented 257 cases of violation against the land environment rights defenders in Asia. As a Global Witness report pointed out, our data also confirms that indeed Asia is one of the deadliest regions for land environment rights defenders in the world. Shockingly, around half of the killing cases against all groups of defenders in Asia were perpetrated against land environment rights defenders. According to our data, 54 out of 101 total cases of killings against defenders implicated the land environment rights defenders. Also, according to our analysis, state actors are one of the main perpetrators of abuse against the land environment rights defenders, yet the role of a non-state actor in harassing them has become increasingly common as well. The primarily include business and corporations in the mining, extractive industry, and agribusiness. They are competing to access natural resource for profit or otherwise seeking to implement a large-scale development project with little regards for its impact on the surrounding community or environment. It is also common for non-state actors to collude with the state actors to repress the defenders. Apart from the killings, judicial harassment is also one of the common forms of abuse against defenders. One of the key examples I can share from our documentation is the companies filing lawsuit against the defenders. This type of abuse is called strategic lawsuit against the public participations, mainly known as a SLAP. Business-linked SLAP are lawsuits that can be civil, criminal, or administrative filed against individuals, including defenders, who are exercising their freedom of expression, association, peaceful assembly to speak about, and also act on matters related to business operations. The main intention here is usually intimidating the person from further engaging in criticism, opposition, and public participations. This should have a chilling effect on free speech and overall the legitimate work of defenders and encourage other companies to file the similar defamation case against them. From a more practical perspective, this tactic exhausts the resources of defenders and those who support them. Financial resources are depleted to cover lawyers' fee, bail, and even travel expenses incurred in attempt to court hearings. The use of physical violence also takes place frequently, especially against women human rights defenders in remote areas, and sometimes the fatal injury leading to the death of defenders. As colleague mentioned earlier, that sadly, COVID-19 pandemic has heightened the danger for defenders in Asia too. From February to July 2020, Forum Asia documented over 90 cases of violation against defenders related to COVID-19 and affecting more than 230 individual defenders and community. Our record shows that community-based defenders, including environment and indigenous people's rights defenders, were the second most targeted groups of defenders for demanding additional government assistance at grassroots level or the suspension of extractive activities. While freedom of defenders and community are restricted by COVID-19 measures, companies are still allowed to carry out their operation during the pandemic, and governments make sure that no protests and demonstrations are allowed. For instance, in India, clearance to business project with a high impact on environment, including mining activity, took place. In the past few months, we were informed by the environmental lawyers that around 190 projects were listed for environmental clearance via online conference without proper public participation process. Defenders were not able to sufficiently counter the project, obviously. In discussing the case of protection for defenders, it is also important to note that many of the defenders belong to local indigenous communities, and they are working collectively to advocate for their rights. So effort to provide protection for land environmental rights defenders should also consider their status as a representative of the communities. Finally, I'd like to share a few key recommendations from land environmental defenders who participated in our private and public discussions. Firstly, a recommendation for private sector business is to avoid using the pandemic to escalate operations that are being questioned by the community for environmental and human rights concerns. There is a need for community consultation, and for indigenous people, strict compliance with the principle of free, prior, and informed consent should not be suspended. Also, to ensure a due diligence process to recognize, monitor, and address the risk of defenders, including women human rights defenders who are generally disproportionately affected. And also, when abuse occurs, ensure the victims have a timely access to effective remedy. Second recommendation for government is to ensure the defenders can carry out the monitoring the human rights situation and keep both states and non-state actors accountable during the period of a pandemic, and also to ensure the full access to protection mechanisms for defenders, including access to justice. Lastly, recommendation to multilateral bodies is to monitor and hold the governments accountable to measure up their human rights commitment, and also to ensure more protection and empowerment of defenders and community to speak out against environmental and human rights concerns. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sejin. I think just to kind of highlight it was especially important to hear your insight and for you to give us that regional analysis of the types of threats faced by defenders, particularly in Asia, but also for going beyond what our report focuses on in terms of its data, and for highlighting the particular use of judicial systems to halt the ability of communities to speak out. And that's something that other organizations like Forum Asia work on quite closely, and that we needs to be part of this conversation. I'd like to swiftly pass on to our next speaker now. It's great who's here, and I'm glad that he's here. Alfred Brownell is the winner of the Goldman Environmental Prize for Africa in 2019. And amongst many other things, he is the founder and lead campaigner of Green Advocates International, and a lead for the West African Grassroots Frontline Land Environmental Defenders Baseline Assessment Project. Alfred, I'm just going to hand straight over to you. I think you might be on mute, Alfred.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, Alfred.
Good. Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this very important conversation, and I'm really glad to be part of this whole process. And so I will proceed with trying to have a conversation about the sort of work that we are doing in West Africa, and really trying to be able to present you some of the cases that we've seen across the region. But before I do that, I just want to make sure I give you a context in terms of my own situations and how I got involved in this whole process and this work. And so on October 26th of 2016, I rushed out of my home with a hot cup of naturally brewed herbal tea. My routine every morning when I was in Liberia included moving back and forth in my yard and harvesting various indigenous herbs that I brewed and drank it with a spoon of natural honey. It was natural Liberian energy herbal boost preparing me for the workday. That morning, my schedule was particularly tight. I headed to the University of Liberia Law School, where I had designed a new environmental law syllabus and had started preparing the new generation of Liberia's environmental lawyers. Then I had a funeral to attend and to make a tribute on behalf of my sister for her mother-in-law who had passed away. So I selected a gray suit. Little did I know that this gray suit would be the only suit that I will wear for the next few weeks while in exile. I was forced to flee Liberia with my wife and kids to seek refuge first in a third country and then in the United States because of my work defending indigenous communities, land and environmental defenders from massive oil palm carnage in Liberia. Who would believe that this will happen in Liberia? Yes, but it did. I am now in the United States as a visiting faculty at Yale Law School, where I teach both environmental law and help to run the clinic. During that time in Liberia, I had both luck and luxury of international connections. This was what saved my life. But thousands of land and environmental defenders are not that lucky and do not have the luxury of international connections, which is a pipe dream. And many of them end up being the statistics that we are going to hear today from this report. This year, we've heard, and many other years before we've heard, that the documented number of lethal attacks against these defenders continue to rise. Unquote. Again, we are forced to report that this is the highest year ever for killing. 212 were murdered in 2019. On average, 4 defenders have been killed ever since December 2015. This is the report we have heard since 2015 from the Global Witness Annual Report. I know from my work and more than 20 years of experience working in the field that this data is not even the tip of the iceberg. In my own Liberia, for example, Friday Thompson was severely beaten and tortured in 2015 and imprisoned. He died in prison and was quickly buried. He did not even have the luxury of his data entering the report in 2015. The 2019 authors have shown why this is the situation. They have stated, and I quote, verifying cases from Africa continues to be difficult. Limited monitoring of the issues by civil society, media repression, and localized conflict mean attacks are probably underreported in some regions, with severe environmental activists reported murder last year. So as a way of drawing attention to this issue, in 2019, with support from the Open Society Foundation, Green Advocate, the organization I funded, partnering with several regional organizations in West Africa, launched a project to establish a support, protection, and response mechanism for grassroots frontline land, environmental, and human rights defenders in West Africa by convening first a West African Defenders Conference in Liberia and then a comprehensive baseline assessment of defenders across the region. We had scheduled a conference in June 2020, but as most of you are aware, we had to hold on to it because of COVID-19. The conference will have been preceded by a comprehensive regional assessment of the experiences, knowledge, lessons learned, skills, expertise, and best practices of defenders at risk and those facing reprisals. The baseline assessment report will have then been utilized to develop and design a community-based protection protocol, policy recommendations, and a strategic funding system flexible enough to support the work of grassroots defenders. The primary target of that assessment will include 16 West African countries plus Equatorial Guinea. Our goal was to reach out to grassroots frontline defenders, the so-called nameless and faceless who are being brutally crushed and decimated in the battle line that is rapidly shifting. Even though we rescheduled the conference, we continue to get involved in the baseline assessment. So for today, I just want to give you a peek into some of the data that we've been collecting across those 16 countries plus Equatorial Guinea. For example, we have documented that in May of 2019, two well-known defenders from Burkina Faso were killed in what looked like an assassination attempt. In Sierra Leone, in January of 2019, two more defenders were killed in a raid in a local community by military personnel who were protecting the oil palm plantation of a multinational corporation. And this other one, even though controversial, and this is an issue in terms of interpretation, in Burkina Faso in October 2019, more than 20 persons were attacked and killed, allegedly by terrorists. This incident, most of you may have heard, is referred to as the Domanin gold mine attack. In Nigeria, just this year, Ijogbeni, a village in Okomo Kingdom, was burned down by the government security forces and private security of an oil palm company. We've also seen increased militarization, criminalization, reprisals that have come across the region. For example, in Senegal, in the village called New France, who are being faced with an Exxon mine. The communities mostly earn their livelihood as rice farmers, but were threatened by this Zygon extraction project that undermined the protected sand dunes that extend along the outer edge of the villages, preventing seawater from flooding their rice paddies. The company, to ensure that it will continue extracting the resources, will always get the support of the Senegalese military to accompany them into the villages to continue threatening the communities. In the Côte d'Ivoire, in Africa, the Simile community, where the Bondoku Manganese Company is mining manganese, resulting in the digging of extraction shaft in more than 200 meters right in the village's entrances, and other extraction facilities around the residential and agricultural areas of that village have caused serious problems to the communities, where they've reported that there's been issues of forced relocation of the villages. They've complained that government officials and security personnel continue to suppress, harass, intimidate, and arrest them from protesting and taking away of their land. In Ghana, a defender during this assessment narrated that a mining company had on several occasions used the army to intimidate and terrorize their communities. He narrated that police and military officers, in partnership with private security forces of the company, stormed their community and the softer community members for protesting against the destruction of their farmland. In Guinea, in the Siguri region of Guinea, in Kitien commune, a woman defender during the assessment also narrated that before the arrival of a gold mining company in their community, they were very happy with life as they had access water, they had enough farmland to undertake agricultural activities. But with the advent of the company, the land was taken over by the company with nothing left over for farming. She narrated that after the company informed the communities it wanted to expand the operation into their village, covering their customary land and farm. They refused. And because they refused, the company then threatened the Guinean government that it will exit the mine. The Guinean government, with military support, accompanied the company, and series of reprisals were brought against this community. They refer to a particular notorious military force called the Beret Rouges that used tear gas and attacked their homes and families. In my own country, Liberia, a defender narrated that a subsidiary of a European agricultural company grabbed their land and destroyed all commercial crops. They broke down their horses, and that they are now living like slaves in their own land. Their secret and sacred forests were completely destroyed and polluted by the company. Unfortunately for them, he said, the government does not show any concern over their predicament. He narrated that state security personnel attached to the company are the ones suppressing the people whenever they try to raise their concerns. He complains of sexual and gender-based violence including risk against the communities.
Thank
In
you so
neighboring
much. Oh,
Syria,
sorry.
finally, in
Sorry,
neighboring
go
Syria
ahead.
alone, we've seen the same issues happening where a woman defender narrated that the military was involved in attack against communities and resulted into some reprisals and the death of two persons. These are the actions that we've seen across West Africa that have come up in our report that I thought is important to illuminate and inform these conversations that we're all having today. Thank you so much for being listening to this.
No, and thank you, Alfred, and sorry to cut you short there, because your intervention, particularly, your willingness to share both your personal experience and the cost to you and your family is really important to hear. But also, as I mentioned in my introduction, there are ongoing difficulties with verifying data from across Africa, and so the work that you're doing is really important. And I'm sure that there'll be plenty of questions in the public chat for you to continue some of these conversations. We're going to move on very, very quickly. So now we will hear from Leon Dulce, who is the National Coordinator for Kalikasan's People's Network for the Environment in the Philippines. This is also an organisation that more recently has responded to increasing concerns over the criminalisation of defenders across the country, with Kalikasan launching a petition calling for the repeal of the government's new anti-terror law. This is an appeal which in the first 5 days has resulted in over 22,000 signatures and 120 organisations worldwide signing on to show their support for Filipino environmental defenders and climate protection. Thank you, Leon. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Rachel. Kalikasan is a national grassroots-led environmental campaign center that has led the work on defending Filipino environmental defenders since 2001. Now, fast forward to April 6, 2020, there were 26 indigenous Tuwali people standing in the middle of a mining access road in Nueva Vizcaya province. They were socially distanced 2 meters apart. They had their face masks on because the COVID-19 pandemic was already in the Philippines by then. The barricaders from the village of Didipio were the only ones standing in the way of some 100 Philippine National Police personnel that were in full riot gear, intent to clear the way for the passage of 3 refueling tankers on their way to the copper gold mine of OceanaGold, an Australian-Canadian mining corporation. The united people of Didipio had nothing but their bodies, their knowledge of their rights, and a handy copy of the restraining order issued against OceanaGold's mining operations that has been repeatedly upheld by the courts in previous months. But the police came with their own document permitting the refueling operations issued by the Office of the President, a document that the local indigenous communities and village officials were not given sufficient opportunity to question or to challenge. It was a document treated by the police as a badge to violently disperse the barricaders, and so they were violently dispersed. All the indigenous people suffered varying degrees of injuries, and 16 of them were later charged with baseless harassment lawsuits. In a recent alarming escalation of the situation, elements of the Philippine military have now suddenly encamped in their village, going house to house with the claim that the community is harboring recruiters of New People's Army rebels. This is how we Filipino environmental defenders live in the Philippines under the dispensation of President Rodrigo Duterte. Each murdered Filipino defender we documented from Duterte's ascension to power in 2016 up to the end of 2019 represents 124 more who suffer threats and intimidation, terror tagging and criminalization, illegal arrests, strategic lawsuits against public participation, and militarization and its consequent forced displacement and dislocation. In 2019, we have the distinction of being the country with the most number of mining-related killings and of being the hotspot of 80% of all agribusiness-related cases in Asia. It is also a sign of impunity that we are the country with the most state employees working to defend the environment killed on one hand, and yet almost half of the documented murders are linked to the state's armed forces and their force multiplier paramilitary groups on the other. In a report we submitted to the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights early this year, we exposed how the Duterte administration's counterinsurgency program itself is inextricably linked to the extractive and destructive economic policies of the regime. And hence, we are easy targets of terror tagging, labeling us as anti-development, anti-government enemies of the state. We noted how the Armed Forces of the Philippines Development Support and Security Plan Kapayapaan or PEACE for 2017 to 2022 stated that the primary task of the AFP with regard to its role in economic development, and I quote, is to provide security to vital installations and infrastructure, critical investments, and development projects. So clearly, this is a war waged against our people and planet. This human rights situation is expected to worsen in 2020 as the Duterte regime resorts to ever worsening authoritarian restrictions amid the coronavirus pandemic, treating the pandemic as a peace and order problem rather than a public health crisis. Mr. Duterte has mobilized more police and soldiers than health workers in responding to COVID-19. Ever since Duterte declared the longest standing COVID-19 lockdown in the world back in March 15, 2020, up to the present, we have monitored at least 555 environmental defenders who have suffered human rights abuses. Mr. Duterte has also taken opportunity of this crisis situation to railroad the passage of the anti-terrorism law, a policy deemed by legal luminaries as even worse than a declaration of martial law in denying freedoms and protections from citizens. Using this same shock and awe tactics, his alter ego in the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, former General Roy Simatu, has also declared that they will aggressively pursue large-scale mining and dredging as COVID-19 economic recovery strategies, and subsequently reversing the mining closure and suspension orders imposed by his predecessor, the late former Secretary Regina Lopez. So it is in this context that the work of Filipino environmental defenders have never been as crucial as ever before. We operate in one of the world's only 18 mega biodiversity countries that is also fifth most mineralized and fourth most climate vulnerable long-term globally. The Philippines is thus a global front line of the multiple existential crises that we face: a zoonotic pandemic, the sixth mass extinction event, runaway climate emergency, and in the Philippines, an endemic bloody climate of impunity. We thus enjoin the international community to stand in solidarity with Filipino environmental defenders. Help us hold the line against the relentless attacks by the Duterte regime and big businesses against the Filipino people and the Philippine environment. A crucial avenue is the upcoming 45th General Session of the UN Human Rights Council. Help us encourage all member states of the UN Human Rights Council to sponsor a resolution calling for an international investigation into the Philippines. Our very rights, our very lives, and our common future and of generations to come are at stake. Mabuhay ang mga tanggol kalikasan ng buong mundo. Long live the environmental defenders of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leon. Finally, we're going to again move quickly on. I'm honoured to introduce our final speaker for today, Timur Manurung, who is the chairman of the NGO Auriga, based in Indonesia. Auriga aims to conserve Indonesian natural resources and the environment.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I'm Timur Manurung, director of Auriga Nusantara and an environmental NGO Indonesia. We in our work we combine analysis, investigation, and also exposing with law enforcement approach. So then, in our team, we have some lawyers that one of their tasks is to defend environmental defenders in Indonesia. That bring us to some occasion being in court defending the defenders. From the in Indonesia is we found from the number we see the trends of increasing of environmental defender threat as we categorize in three types: physical threat, psychological or intimidation, and the biggest one in Indonesia is what we call criminalization. So using legal terms in putting activists or environmental offenders to jail. uh, in the last 5 years, 2014 to 2018, we're documenting about 38 cases threat to the environmental defenders. So we focus on the environmental defenders, which in the last year only, 2019, there were 8 cases, which 3 of them is being killed. Uh, from what analyzing case by case, we see that actually the cause not only by Indonesian or Indonesian governments. Yes, we have some controversial or improper planning development by the government, improper analysis or assessment in setting up projects, also improper permit process. That issuing permit in some area is natural forest or in management area of local people, including adat. Adat is customary land. But it is also the trend of the investment that particularly we need to emphasize the China investor source, that like in One Belt One Road initiative or Belt Road initiative in collaboration with the government, and let the government that put up improper plan and projects. In North Sumatra, for example, last year the activists or the defenders that being killed is linked with the dam project in the province that threatening natural forest that contain tigers, Sumatran tigers, orangutan, and many uh, threatened species there. So my recommendation actually not only in Indonesian government side. Yes, we have some problems that quite I think it quite similar or trend in the current era in the world. What we call is political corruption, that combining political parties, public figure, and law enforcement here. And I we see also trends in other countries, but also from the investor side. So from the particularly here is in China based China source investment. Uh, and the way we can go or tackle this, I think, is by in solidarity and in close coordination, join or close collaboration with media. So there is a proper or strong monitoring in the field or strong support. And yes, but also we have some homework in our country in improving the code of conduct in the law enforcement activities, and also in the government proper permit issuance or plan development planning setting up. That's from me, Rachel. Over to you,
Thank
Rachel.
you. Yes, thank you so much, Timur, for your statement there. We're slightly behind time, so we may not be able to take questions from the floor. But please feel free, if any questions are directed to any of our panelists in the chat, they can also respond via the chat itself. We're going to move swiftly on to the question answer segment. A big thank you to everybody who submitted questions before the event. I'm going to jump in on these and call on a few of our panelists to share their insight. I'm afraid because of time, not everybody will get to answer every question. So I will call on you to do so. So question one, to what extent are multinational companies linked to attacks against land environment activists, and what is the role for investors to engage? I think, Sejin, if you would feel free to answer, and then Leon, we could come straight to you afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. I think a responsible business cannot thrive in closed society where cronyism, corruption prospers, and also fundamental freedom are violated. And when it comes to acting, responsible companies evaluate the risk of action for sure, but also assess the risk of inaction. Companies can take a different action to protect defenders for sure. First, the obvious move could be to directly approach governments and also using the same discreet diplomacy tactics and advocacy utilized to promote their commercial interests, pushing the message that the burden on civil society defenders should not be greater than theirs. Of course, we need to also take into account the possibility that host government might not be willing to listen to companies on the issue related to this. In this case, a company can influence host governments by leveraging the influence of their home governments, for example, through embassies, or even more advocate in their home country for legislation that establish legal liability requirements to do business in specific host countries. And companies also can undertake public initiative. And in this regard, it's very important to publicly recognize that human rights defenders are critical partners in identifying the risk or problems, and of course, to avoid interfering in the defenders' legitimate work. Important also to publicly acknowledge that the protection of the civic space, the civic freedom, and respect for the rule of law are important both for civil society and business. Thank you.
Leon, would you like to go next? If you'd like to answer this one.
Sure, thanks, Rachel. Well, in the data that was discussed earlier, there's a clear link between multinational corporations and the aggressive increase of killings and other human rights violations. And it's linked to the policy atmosphere that are in our countries where because of it being natural resource rich and with weak laws and regulations, it's very easy for international investment to pour into the country. So, for instance, it's hard to pinpoint which corporations, following the money trail, which corporations are directly linked to uh, to certain human rights violations by virtue of the corporate veil, by virtue of the impunity. But we can assume that entire industries where the trends of killings are prevalent are involved one way or another. So, for instance, the mining industry in the Philippines is wholly export-oriented. More than 95% of our minerals are immediately shipped out to foreign destinations for processing or for down the supply chain. So you can assume that the destinations where raw mineral materials go to, like such as in Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, China, are definitely linked to the human rights violations here in the Philippines. And the same goes for agribusiness plantations. Corporations must take effort to really ensure that their supply chains are not linked to local economic activities that are driving social conflict among indigenous and peasant communities in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you both. We'll move on to our second question that came in before the event started. And that is, in Liberia, many families depend on stone mining and burning forest to fetch wood and sell as their only source of income. How do we address the increase in logging, both in Liberia and beyond? Alfred, I'll bring you in on this one. Could you give your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I should give my talk on that. I think what has happened with reference to how do we address the whole question of increased logging, not just in Liberia, but also in a number of the countries across the region, is first going back to our bases and getting to understand, for example, the forest that we had, how did that get preserved? A lot of the logging activities is driven by the work of, transnational corporations that opened up, putting rules into the place, and then a number of other local actors. But they have not developed the kind of logging model that would be attuned with what indigenous people have been involved with in Liberia. And so the idea that you will cut the trees and you export the logs, all adding value and increasing local content on the ground in Liberia, has been a huge challenge that the government has not been able to address. Because also the whole question of perception, they look at what indigenous communities have been involved with in how they use the forest. So going back and rethinking what that model is and trying to reduce the whole question of industrialized logging process could be a way of trying to do that. That will also be, for example, trying to secure rights and tenure of local communities, which has been what the problem is. The other, I think, issue that we need to also address is the whole question of what kind of models are being developed, because Liberia has seen reform in its forestry law over time, very progressive reform that have now recognized the rights of indigenous communities to be able to manage and own the forest land. But what has happened is that the design of the model in terms of how communities could manage the forest is what has been it's what has been problematic, because one is that the model has looked at more of a development process where it becomes extremely bureaucratic and expensive for communities to establish community logging processes. And then where they were unable to establish the logging processes, you have had elite private logging actors who have come and taken advantage of loophole in the system to drive logging going forward. So trying to close those loopholes, working with a community to develop indigenous community models of commercialization and developing local content to make sure there's value added on the log, that Liberia does not become a perpetual exporter of timber, but can even process that locally and develop the domestic market, could be a way of trying to address some of these things. There's also the whole question of reforestation, which is something that has not happened a lot. That they focus more on trying to cut down the tropical forest. But hopefully, if you address that question of local content development and you bring on board the indigenous knowledge that locals have used to manage that forest, it could be of ways trying to address the increased logging so that you focus much more on supplying the domestic market than allowing Liberia to look forward. Then there's also the question of, should we really focus more on logging or other non-extractive activities in Liberia? And I think part of what we've seen over and over is that the way the law was structured, it makes the forest agency feel that its major function is to give us logging license. But forestry is much more than just logging. There are other activities that exist in the sector that, if fully harnessed, could allow for proper reduction of the increased logging that we see across Liberia. So they need to invest in community entrepreneurship, especially the one developed by the locals, could be a way of trying to address that. So you don't focus more on just cutting timber. You could look at issues like non-timber forest product. You can look at environmental services and other, ecotourism that we are allowed to address. But even the whole question of trying to capture carbon could be a way of seeing how we can reduce the impact of large logging commercial processes in Nigeria.
Thank you for that, Alfred. I guess just a quick comment on logging. So last year, our report found that logging was the sector with the greatest increase in risk to with links to killings globally, with an 85% more recorded attacks against defenders who were opposing this particular industry. A large number of these were actually in the Philippines. So I wondered, Leon, if you could perhaps give a brief comment on the importance of the ecosystems that are under attack in the country and the impacts of logging.
So in the Philippines, we've done this analysis of estimating the ecosystem values of the work being done by Filipino environmental defenders by looking at how what is the exact expanse of protected areas, forest areas, mineralized lands, etc. And then using scientific researches, existing literature, we made an estimate of their value. So we estimate that under the first 3 years of the Duterte administration, the total number of Philippine environmental defenders that suffered human rights abuses collectively protected around 6.2 million hectares of landscapes and seascapes, and about 3.3 million hectares of these are forested lands. So that really shows how crucial the work of environmental defenders are in preserving and enhancing our climate critical forests in the country. And we observed a scientific institute in the Philippines observed, especially now in the COVID-19 era, a sudden increase in activities of forest burning, activities of forest clearing related to Sweden agriculture and other destructive but small scale operations. It's anyway, it's a manifestation of a more systemic problem. It's a manifestation of an economy that does not provide sustainable industries and jobs for its people. So really what we need is a shift from the jobs and industries being developed in our country to enable people to not resort to destructive practices once their livelihood and once their economic securities are challenged by the crisis that they're facing.
Thank you so much for that. We'll move on to our next question that came in. Who and how will compensate the families of environmental defenders, both those who have passed on and those who are those communities that are alive? And what are the most important things that international supporters can do now to help defenders? Timur, it'd be great if we could hear your thoughts on that.
For sure, this is traditional aspect of this actually is government, right? Because this is in its constitution of every country, I think, to protect their citizens. But now this is we need to, in terms of this, as also the government actors sometimes part of the problem. So we need to, I think, we need raising a public support of this is one of the way that helping them. And international support that we can do for this also in raising support and also in pushing the government in both formal and informal fora to 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 have better governance, better permit process, for example, in our country case, and also in many government events, in intergovernment event that we can raise support or advocacy for the government here. So yeah, that's the, I think, also one thing that quite as we see that uh, this sector in our country is mostly as we are facing in sunset industry in logging. Uh, Most of our sector at the moment is plantation and mining. So I think it's also international supported to make sure that commodities that being traded internationally from or being absorbed from our country is the responsible one. So then no historical or not track of threaten of people and the vendors in their supply chain. That's from me, Rachel.
Thank you so much for that, Timur. It looks like that's all we've got time for today. So a big thank you again for these questions and to our amazing and dedicated panelists for giving us their time and leadership, and for everybody who's come along to the event. We'll try and include responses to as many of the questions that have been submitted in our blog about the event, which will be released soon. It's been extremely valuable to hear from Sejin on how states and non-state actors have continued to have an impact on defenders, especially during the escalation of COVID-19, which can be seen across Asia. The restrictions that are really being felt by defenders whilst business operations continue to expand. Sejin also talked, we also heard about how important it is that businesses don't forget about free, prior, and informed consent. We also heard from Alfred on how the data that we have is not even the tip of the iceberg when it comes to violence and attacks against land and environmental defenders in Liberia. It was so valuable to really hear some of the initial data that's coming out of the baseline project that he's spearheading and its effort to identify some of the so-called nameless and faceless who have been brutally attacked as part of their efforts to protect the environment. We also heard from Leon, who explained how Duterte has mobilized more police workers and health workers during this COVID-19 pandemic, but also about the escalating impact on communities because of that. So the very rights and freedoms at risk that were highlighted, basically, all of our support and solidarity goes out to defenders in the Philippines who are part of this campaign. And finally, I'd like to thank Timur. It's been incredibly insightful to hear from you, particularly your recommendations on how to tackle the imbalances of power where corporate and state interests overlap, and to hear about the work that Auriga is doing to raise awareness of these root causes. If you would like to find out more about any of our panelists, we'll be sending around an email in the next few weeks with details and more materials, including a recording of this event. You can also find out more about Global Witness's Defenders campaign by visiting globalwitness.org/defenders. Thank you again to everybody for joining, and thank you again to our panelists. We'd just like to say that we stand in solidarity with all defenders and particularly with our panelists, and we wish you all a very good rest of the day. Thank you.